The Royal Titans are now here, and this video is going to give you everything you need to know about these bosses, from recommendations to requirements to tips, as well as both solo and duo KC strategies. That way you are covered regardless of what strategy you decide to take. In addition to that, we're getting to some of the advanced tips you're going to see later in the video, so stay tuned to that. So we got ourselves a Fire and Ice Giant boss with an Elemental Staff as a reward. You might be thinking that you're going to be using Elemental Magic against this boss, right? Turns out you would be wrong. The main style you're going to be using here is melee. In terms of the melee gear you will want, it is your standard best strength melee gear you got on you. For weapon, anything from a whip, tent whip, blade of Saldor, moving forward to, Soul Reaper Axe, Noxus Halberd, and of course Scythe, Inquisitor Mace. Those are all great. None of the individual styles mean anything in terms of crush versus slash versus stab, because the defenses are relatively even across the board. You wouldn't bring something like a Fang because the bosses aren't particularly tanky. You're not going to get much of a benefit from that. In terms of a range switch, these bosses are a little bit weird. They say that they have high range defense, but during certain parts of the fight, it feels like their range defense is toned down, specifically during the parts of the fight where you have to attack with range for extra damage. I personally like bringing a 4-way Addle switch. That just gave me a lot of damage, and 3-tick felt very comfortable. I also tried Blowpipe. 6-way Blowpipe switch felt okay as well. More susceptible to loose ticks if you're not fast enough with your switches. If you're very new, I would even recommend a 1 or 2-way Addle switch. That should be enough. And you could also consider bringing a Zerite's Crossbow switch for the spec. From what we could tell right now, it's fairly optional to even take Mage, but firstly, you'll want to bring the standard spellbook, and you'll want to bring fire and water spells. That way you can deal with the fire and water mechanics, specifically the barrier that shows up and the minions that are spawned from each of the bosses. In order to take out the minions from each of the bosses, you're going to need a good enough Mage accuracy bonus in order to actually one-shot them. I was taking about a 4-way switch. Anything less than that seemed like it wasn't high enough Mage to not splash on them, so you're going to need a 4-way switch if you want to do that. For the walls, obviously you just need the spells to cast. Now the Twin Flame Staff does have a use here if you do have it. What's really cool is that it automatically switches between fire and water spells, so you can quickly take out the minions, you can quickly take out the walls. The walls are 0-tick time, so that's really good. It's not going to lower your DPS while you're hitting the boss if you do it properly. The minions, however, I believe there's a little bit of a delay, or 1-tick delay or something like that, so you might lose a little bit of DPS, but as a result, you'll end up taking less damage. You can use a Fairy Ring AIQ, Mudskipper Point, then go down to the Asgardian Dungeon. If you have the agility level, you can cross this cave. If not, just simply walk around. This is a run you won't have to be doing too often though, because the boss drops an amulet fairly commonly that will teleport you directly to this boss. In between old school updates, I like to check out the updates in other games that I play, and this game I've been playing has an update that brings me back to my childhood, which as old school players, let's be honest, we are constantly trying to recreate that. Back when I heard about Raid Shadow Legends like 5 years ago, I didn't think much of it. Fast forward though, and the game is still going strong. So when Raid reached out to talk about their new event, Alice's Adventure, I was pretty excited. You'll be able to earn the legendary champion Alice the Wanderer simply by logging in during the event over 7 days. There is also the event dungeon, which has the Queen of Hearts, where you can earn awesome rewards. And over a month of playing the event, you'll be able to earn all 5 legendary champions from the Alice in Wonderland universe. If you use the link in my description, you will get a huge starter pack. This includes 2 epic champions, Drake and the Errant Knight. Plus, after downloading with my link, you can use a promo code Monkey King to get access to one of the newer legendary champions, Sun Wukong. These bonuses, along with the Alice's Adventure event, will help you catch up in Raid if you've never played before. Let's start with the mechanics of the fight, starting with Phase 1. When you enter the room, both bosses are briefly going to be in melee range. There's actually a tip here. You can get a quick hit off with melee on at least one of them if you spam click the boss as soon as you see them. Once they do that, they're going to move out to range. You're going to switch to your ranged items. Now, they will eventually come back to melee, and that's indicated by the text above their head. That's when you're going to switch back to melee. The other mechanics you're going to deal with here are the wall special. That is simply a wall that's going to be impassable. You can choose to use a water or a fire spell on it respectively, the opposite style, or you can choose to ignore them. There's definitely benefits to both, but most of the time ignoring them is a really, really good thing, and we'll get into that later. The other thing they will be doing is spawning these minions. You can protect melee against them to avoid damage from them naturally, but eventually, at an undetermined time, they do begin to explode. So you'll have to either take the damage, or you can decide to use a fire or water spell on them, depending on what their opposite is. As long as you got a 4-way mage switch or high enough mage bonus, you will be able to one-shot them, but this does require you to bring a mage switch. You could also try to avoid their damage, but it can be very difficult to do with the walls there and how small the arena is at this time. The last thing they'll do is this slam attack, sort of like their auto attack. It's 3 tiles wide and you could move out of it, but if you're protecting melee, you take no damage from this anyways. Once you get one of the bosses to around 200 HP, it's going to trigger phase 2. That's going to bring both of the bosses inside of the arena on either side, and there'll be some similar and varying mechanics to work with. The new mechanic you'll have to deal with that's very unique is this emblem mechanic. There's going to be this little tile on the floor that's marked by this fire and ice emblem and a little timer associated with. There's also an audio timer you can kind of listen to. You'll have to stand on this before the timer runs out. If you don't, the bosses are going to start doing fire and ice slam attacks. They're going to do 3 slam attacks in total. While you're on this tile, this is a really good time to eat up because you're not dealing melee damage, or switch to your range to deal some range damage. There is another advanced mechanic we'll talk about, but we'll get into that during the advanced section of this video. Now, in terms of familiar mechanics, you're still gonna have them do a slam attack that really you can't dodge. You're just protecting melee and taking no damage, and they're still gonna be spawning minions. The minions are a little bit easier to deal with if you decide not to take them out with your spells. Running around is a little bit more successful, I find, here, because you got a lot more room to work with compared to when you had the walls blocking your way before. The other thing that makes these thralls a little bit easier to deal with is during the emblem slam attack, where there's fire and ice slams on the floor, if the minion is currently occupying a square of their opposite style, they get taken out completely from that without dealing any damage to you. So you can use this to your advantage. Firstly, it can just be kind of random and they'll passively die that way. Or you can try to position yourself in a way where you know they're going to take damage from the slam, but that's a little bit more of an advanced mechanic we'll get into again a little bit later. The goal of this phase is to finish both bosses at the same time. If you take out one boss before the other boss, what will happen is you'll have a sort of enrage phase where you'll take a lot more chip damage, and the emblem special will be on the other side of the room, which means you're going to be dealing less damage as well. So ideally, you kind of treat it like how you would treat Olm Hands for P3 if you're familiar. If you're not familiar, this will teach you about that. Get one to very low, but don't get it too low. You don't want to one-shot it, and then focus the other one. So this first KC I'm going to show you is a little bit more of the intended mechanic KC. This isn't the one I've done too much of. I've kind of avoided a lot of the mechanics. First advanced tip, when you get into the room, you want to spam click the fire giant boss. So if you set up your camera similar to how I had set up, you can click it. That way you can get a melee hit off right away, which is more damage. Here you can see I'm casting a water spell on the wall and then immediately attacking the boss without losing any ticks. That you can do if you're taking out those flame and ice walls. Now the boss is switching over to melee, which means I switch over to melee. I'm kind of showing examples here of taking out the walls when I don't really need to. That's totally fine. And I'm only focusing one boss here. The reason why I want to do this is I want to get them to P2 as quick as possible, because in P2 I'm going to have much more opportunity in melee, which is our strong style. We switch over to range and we do that. Now these things spawn, and I'm going to try to use the mechanic here where I attack him with the relevant spells. I had to switch to my mage gear, took him both out, and now we don't have to deal with any of that chip damage. We did lose, of course, a little bit of DPS, but now we're not getting chipped. So again, it's up to you if you want to do this. Text line comes out, we're switching back to melee, we're protecting melee, which you can camp melee the whole fight really. That's up to you. If you want to save some prayer, you can turn it off at the beginning of the fight, and you can turn it off when they go outside of melee range. So during P2, again, we got these guys spawning, so I'm going to switch over to my mage gear. I'm going to take them both out. Looks like I missed that one completely. It's a little bit hard to do. There we go. And now we're going to the floor mechanic. And here I switch to my range so I can get some extra hits before going back to melee. So if you're doing the intended, you're doing a lot more gear switches, which is the intention of these bosses, to get you more into gear switching. We've had, Scurious, which is more about prayer switching. We had Moons, which is a lot about movement, and these bosses are a lot about switching your gear if you're doing the intended mechanics. Even if you're not, you're still switching between range and melee quite a bit. So now I've got this boss pretty low. I'm going to start focusing on the fire boss because we want to take them out at the same time. This is kind of similar to the Olm Hands, which is kind of cool because you're going to start getting used to doing this perhaps before you take out Olm for the first time. So you're going to understand not to deal too much damage to one of the bosses. Okay, so now we're stepping on the towel, we're hitting with some range. They're both within KC range here, so we're just going to take one out and then immediately go to the next one. That's an example of a solo kill trying to use some of the intended mechanics with Mage. Next up, I'm going to show you my type of KC I normally do. I'm starting at the end of a kill because I want to show you that I bring the Desert Amulet, then I bring the amulet for these bosses and immediately go back in. That way I'm getting, topped up right away. If you're using Soul Reaper Axe, you're losing less stacks. You can see here, I also bring Burning Claws. You want to use spec weapons like Burning Claws, Dragon Claws, even Void Waker. It depends on what you have. ZCB is also very popular. Here you can see I'm completely ignoring the walls. And in some ways that kind of does me a favor. You can see the minions actually spawned outside of the walls. If any of those explode before the walls go down, then I take no damage from them. I think in this clip, most of them survive, if not close to all of them, but it still shows you that sometimes these walls can actually be an advantage. I tried to do a little bit of running here, but I don't want to lose out on damage, so I opt to take the hits instead. We're pretty low now, and this is where you can I'm not actually healing right away here. I decide to heal when I get to the pool, because I'm going to deal less damage with range anyway, so I might as well heal then. Get one range hit, then switch to melee. And I'm going to ignore these thralls completely. I'll take some chip damage. Now when I go over here, you're going to see that the fire ones are going to take the ice slam, which means that they're completely gone. So even if you're taking them out with magic attacks, you could decide to only take out one of them, knowing that the other one is likely going to get taken out by the slam. Okay, so both of the bosses are low now. We took out one of them there. This one I know only has about 30 HP. Ideally, we take it out pretty quickly, and it's gone. So now we got a duo KC, which is very similar to a solo KC. The biggest difference is that it's very fast compared to solo. We're both hitting the Fire Giant boss. We're not too worried about the wall here because we're both together, so we know that one of us isn't going to be blocked out. My friend here does take out one of the walls, but that's not a problem because 0 tick loss there. He does bring in the minions there, which maybe we could have avoided, maybe not, depends. So we're just hitting this boss, and the biggest thing here is you can see it is a lot quicker than solo. So I do recommend duo if you can do duo, but solo's not too bad. We're phasing the boss now. If you look at the boss, I hit it once, he hits it once, and it's 40 HP. So now we're just focusing on the ice boss for the rest of the KC. There is an advanced tip here. If you time your melee hits in between slams like that, you can actually get a melee hit off during that phase. That's a very, very advanced tip, and it really works during certain timing, but the benefit of that is getting a melee hit off versus getting a range hit off or doing a range switch is going to be a lot more damage. So if you can pull that off, I recommend it, but you can't do it in situations like this where the floor tile isn't within 2 tiles. One of the things I want to show in a dual KC is if you attack the Fire Giant boss and then switch to the Ice Giant boss right away, you can end up meleeing both of them. Of course you can do this in a solo. The reason why I bring this up here is the fact that in a duo, you're more likely to extend your trip and do multiple KC. In a solo, you might opt to only do a couple KC or maybe do what I do, which is every single kill, reset, get full spec, and go back in. Here's another duo clip I want to show you. And the reason why I want to show you this one, couple of things. Firstly, this wall here, we ignore it completely, and then the Ice Giant boss spawns its minions on the opposite side. Notice as this clip goes on, those minions are going to start exploding at random times, but all 3 of them explode before they reach us. So that's just a benefit to not having to deal with these walls. It's actually beneficial a lot of times to keep it up. You could also use these walls technically to bring the thralls over them as they're spawning, and they will explode if they end up being the same style, but that's very hard to do. You'll also notice there that there was a wall heading into P2. Sometimes you'll get unlucky and there'll be a wall there where you actually need to definitely use a fire and a water spell. That's why it's recommended for at least one of you to bring the standard spellbook. If you bring thralls are obviously really, really good, but there is a chance you might get bad timing and end up dealing with a wall that you can't really do anything about, and you'll end up just stalling damage more than your thrall would have dealt. And that's everything you need to know about the Royal Titans. Hopefully you guys are enjoying these bosses. Let me know in the comments below.